Dawn breaks over the harbor, but the light feels wrong. It hangs in the air like dust that never settles. A dock worker tightens the strap of his sandal. The leather is cracked, salt has eaten it thin. He tastes smoke before he sees it. Not the clean smoke of hearth fires, but something bitters-in, pitch, burning rope. Somewhere beyond the warehouses, metal rings against stone. Not the rhythm of work, the wrong rhythm. Fast, panicked, the wind carries shouting in a language he half knows, half doesn't. Then the scream of animals. Then the thud of something heavy collapsing with giving up after years of trust. He turns toward the city. The walls are still standing, but the gates are jammed. Carts clog the streets. Grain sacks split open underfoot, wheat spilling like sand, trampled into the mud. A child coughs, dry and sharp, as if the air itself is cutting her throat. Someone runs past him clutching a clay table 10 account ledger, baked hard by fire before it can ever be read again. Above it all, the sound that doesn't belong, silence from the temples. No bells, no chants, no calm voice promising that the gods are watching. This is not a single raid, not a bad harvest, not even a war in the way people understand war. This feels systemic, like the city itself has lost the memory of how to breathe. Across the eastern Mediterranean, in places that have traded with each other for centuries, mornings like this are unfolding at roughly the same time. Palaces that have stood for generations will be empty by nightfall. Writing systems will vanish. Roads will go quiet. Names of kings will end midline. And somewhere in the confusion, a question hangs heavier than smoke. How does an entire world, connected, confident collapse almost at once? This collapse is not local, it is not brief, and it is not subtle. Between roughly 1200 and 1150 BCE, the great powers of the late Bronze Age, Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire, New Kingdom Egypt's outer territories, Ugarit, Cyprus, and much of the Levant either fall, fracture, or retreat into survival mode. Cities are burned and never rebuilt. Long-distance trade disappears almost entirely. Writing, administration, and centralized government vanish from whole regions for centuries. Population estimates vary, but archaeologists agree on the direction: sharp decline. In some areas, settlement density drops by 5,090%. Complex societies that took hundreds of years to assemble unravel in a few generations, sometimes in one. This is not just the end of cities, it is the end of systems. The Bronze Age world was held together by diplomacy, tribute, shipping routes, palace economies, and shared assumptions about order, about how grain moves, how power is inherited, how gods are appeased, how violence is contained. When those assumptions fail, nothing small replaces them. What follows is not a smooth transition into something new, but a long, grinding dark, what later historians will call a collapse, because no single word feels large enough. And to understand how it happens, we have to return to a world that believed it was unbreakable. Before it broke, this world worked. From the Aegean to the Nile, the late Bronze Age was an age of confidence. Palaces rose behind thick walls. Harbors were crowded with ships carrying copper from Cyprus, tin from far-off mountains, grain from river valleys, luxury goods from everywhere. Bronzian alloy that required cooperation across vast distances was not just a metal. It was proof that the system functioned. Kings wrote to one another as equals. We still have their letters, polite, calculating, sometimes petty. They exchanged gifts, daughters, doctors, and threats wrapped in ceremony. War existed, but it was regulate sieges, treaties, ransoms. Violence had rules. Climate, for a time, seemed cooperative. Harvests were reliable enough to support specialists, scribes who never touched a plow, priests who memorized rituals, craftsmen who spent years perfecting a single technique. Cities became dense. Bureaucracies grew confident in their records. Gods were fed on schedule. This was a world optimized for efficiency, not resilience. Everything depended on everything else. Grain shipments had to arrive on time. Armies needed bronze weapons. Palaces needed surplus to maintain loyalty. Writing was essential. Without tablets, the system could not remember who owed what to whom. To live in this world was to believe that complexity itself was strength. That connection meant security. That tomorrow would look very much like today. They had no reason to think otherwise. The very things that made the late Bronze Age powerful also made it fragile. Bronze itself was the first warning sign. It required tin, a rare metal often sourced hundreds, sometimes thousands, of kilometers away. A disrupted caravan, a hostile mountain pass, a port closed for a season. Any one of these could freeze weapon production, tool repair, even farming equipment. There was no local backup, no substitute waiting in reserve. Trade networks grew dense and fast but also narrow. Cities specialized. One port handled copper, another grain, another luxury goods that kept elites loyal. Efficiency replaced redundancy. Palaces optimized supply instead of buffering failure. Urbanization amplified the risk. Large populations meant dependence on stored grain. Miss one harvest, and the margin vanished. Miss two, and hunger became political. People who once fed themselves now waited on institutions that could fail. Even diplomacy was a vulnerability. Peace relied on mutual stability. When one kingdom stumbled, refugees crossed borders. Raiders tested defenses. Treaties became irrelevant overnight. Collapse did not respect borders. The system had no off switch. When pressure built, it did not bend, it cascaded. What had once been strength became a conduit, carrying stress faster and farther than any army ever could. And somewhere beyond the horizon, multiple pressures were already gathering. The collapse does not begin with fire. It begins with strain. Pollen records, lake sediments, and tree ring data suggest that in the decades before 1200 BCE, parts of the eastern Mediterranean experienced prolonged drought. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough to matter. Harvests grew unpredictable. Grain reserves thinned. Prices rose. At the same time, populations were high. Cities were dense. Margins were thin. Political stress followed environmental stress. Rulers faced rising costs feeding cities, maintaining armies, funding temples while surplus shrank. To compensate, they demanded more. More tax, more labor, more loyalty. The system tightened like a rope pulled too far. Movement increased. Groups displaced by hunger or conflict began migrating, some peacefully, some violently. Coastal defenses were tested. Frontier regions grew unstable. Raiders probed shipping lanes that had once been safe by habit alone. None of this looked like apocalypse. It looked like noise. A bad year, then another. A revolt crushed. A letter sent asking for emergency grain. An ally slow to respond. Each problem manageable. Together, corrosive. By the time flames appear in the archaeological record, the world is already exhausted. All it needs now is a spark. On the coast of what is now northern Syria, the city of Ugarit waits for help. It is a wealthy port. Its warehouses are full of tablets, contracts, prayers, shipping lists. Its scribes write quickly, urgently. We still have their words, preserved by the very fire that ends the city. One letter goes out to a neighboring king, another to Cyprus. The message is clear. Enemy ships have appeared. The countryside is unsafe. We are running out of options. There is no grand speech, no prophecy of doom, just administration under stress. Ugarit is not alone. It expects the system to work the way it always has. Allies will respond. Grain will arrive. The threat will pass. It doesn't. The ships keep coming. Who they are is still debated: raiders, migrants, displaced peoples, or coalitions formed by desperation. Later Egyptian inscriptions will call some of them the Sea Peoples, but that name hides more than it explains. What matters is not who they are, but that they arrive faster than the network can respond. The city burns. The palace collapses inward. Tablets fall from shelves, unfinished, mid-sentence. Ugarit is never rebuilt. This is the moment the collapse becomes undeniable. Not because one city falls, but because a fully connected, literate, diplomatic hub dies waiting for help that no longer exists. The network has failed. Once the network breaks, collapse travels faster than any messenger. Along the Anatolian plateau, the Hittite Empire begins to fragment. Its capital, Hattusa, is abandoned, not conquered and occupied, simply left behind. Archives stop, roads empty, provincial governors vanish from the record. An empire that once dictated terms across the region dissolves into silence. Across the Aegean, Mycenaean palaces, Messene, Pylos, Tiryns burn in waves. The destruction is uneven but relentless. Linear B tablets record frantic mobilizations, weapons being issued, watchers posted on the coast. Then the writing stops. For centuries, in the Levant, coastal cities fall one after another. Trade ports that once linked Egypt to Mesopotamia go dark. Shipping lanes empty. Copper stops moving. Tin disappears entirely. Even Egypt, the most resilient of the great powers, feels the shock. Inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses III describe invasions by land and sea. Egypt survives but barely and only by withdrawing, fortifying, and abandoning its empire abroad. This is not a single wave. It is a chain reaction. Each collapse removes support from the next. Grain shortages become famines elsewhere. Refugees become raiders. Lost trade becomes lost legitimacy. Kings lose the ability to reward loyalty, and loyalty evaporates. The system is coming apart joint by joint. Collapse is not loud all the time. Sometimes it sounds like nothing. Markets fail first. Weights and measures stop matching. Coins do not exist yet, but trust doesn't. It drains away. A sack of grain today is worth more than a promise of 10 tomorrow. Trade shrinks to face-to-face exchange, then shrinks again. Law follows. Courts stop meeting. Written contracts become useless when no authority remains to enforce them. Disputes are settled by kin, by strength, or not at all. Old grudges return because nothing restrains them anymore. Temples falter. Offerings dry up as surplus vanishes. Priests repeat rituals whose power once depended on abundance and order. The gods feel distant, not angry, just absent. Smoke rises from fewer altars. Cities begin to feel like bodies shutting down. Streets clog with debris. Wells go unrepaired. Disease spreads quietly. The young leave first. The skilled follow. Those who remain are the old, the trapped, the stubborn, and the unlucky. Writing disappears not because people forget how, but because there is no reason to write. No taxes to record. No shipments to track. No future to plan. A city does not fall in a day. It empties. And once emptied, it is astonishing how quickly stone becomes ruin. People did not experience this as systemic collapse. They experienced it as confusion. The intellectual tools of the late Bronze Age were moral and ritual, not structural. When harvests failed and enemies arrived, the question was not what mechanism broke, but who offended the gods. Kings intensified offerings, more sacrifices, older rituals, processions meant to restore balance. If the world was unraveling, it must be because order mat, cosmic harmony, divine favor had been disturbed. Some responses were practical. Cities repaired walls. Armies were reorganized. Egypt fortified its borders and redeployed resources inward. Others tried to simplify, abandon large centers for smaller, defensible settlements. Families broke away from palace economies and returned to subsistence farming where possible. But many decisions made sense only in the short term. Rulers hoarded grain to maintain authority, accelerating famine outside palace walls. Forced labor increased even as productivity fell. Loyalty was demanded when it could no longer be bought. No one could see the whole picture. There was no map of the system, only fragments of experience, local and urgent. They were solving yesterday's problems with yesterday's logic, while the ground itself was changing. When explanations fail, fear looks for a face. As food grows scarce and authority weakens, suspicion fills the gaps. Strangers are no longer traders or guests, they are risks. Refugees arriving at city gates are not seen as victims of the same disaster, but as harbingers of itmiths that will consume what little remains. Violence follows this logic easily. Raiding becomes justified as survival. Communities turn inward. Kinship hardens into a boundary line, us and not us. Old ethnic label sounds flexible. Often political become sharper, more dangerous. Scapegoating appears where power cannot protect. If the gods are angry, someone must have angered them. Priests, foreigners, marginal groups, or rival factions become convenient explanations. This does not solve the crisis. It only channels panic into cruelty. Archaeology shows signs of sudden destruction inside cities, not just from invaders, but from internal conflict. Walls breached from within, neighborhoods burned unevenly, mass graves without ceremony. It is crucial to be clear. These acts are not evidence of barbarism replacing civilization. They are evidence of systems collapsing faster than human trust can adapt. Fear narrows the moral horizon. People do what seems necessary to survive the next week, even if it poisons the next generation. This is not a lesson about ancient brutality. It is a warning about what happens when security disappears and meaning fractures. For a time, rural regions seem safer. Fields are farther from raiders. Villages are smaller, less visible. Families fall back on habits older than palimpsest: harvest, store, repeat. Life contracts, but it continues. Then the shock arrives anyway. Without cities, there are no markets for surplus. Without palaces, there is no redistribution in bad years. Tools break and cannot be replaced. Bronze sickles are reforged again and again until they fail. When tin disappears, metalworking itself becomes uncertain. Migrant groups move inland, following rivers and arable land. Some settle, some clash with those already there. Land that was once clearly owned under royal authority becomes negotiable and contested. Seasonal rhythms fracture. A single failed harvest now means starvation, not hardship. Fields are abandoned. Irrigation channels clog. Terraces collapse. Soil erodes back into rivers. Frontiers blur. The distinction between farmer, herder, and raider dissolves. Survival favors mobility and violence over stability and record keeping. From the outside, it looks like decline. From inside, it feels like constant improvisation. The collapse is no longer about kings or empires. It is about whether a household makes it through winter. The collapse does not end with a victory. It ends with exhaustion. By the mid-1100s BCE, there is less left to break. Cities that could burn already have. Trade routes are silent because there is nothing moving on them. Palaces are gone, so there is no longer a center to overthrow. Population decline, brutal as it is, reduces pressure on land. Fewer mouths compete for the same fields. In some regions, climate conditions stabilize slightly, or at least become predictable enough to plan around again. The great droughts do not vanish everywhere, but people adapt to a lower baseline. Crucially, the networks stay broken. Without long-distance trade, societies simplify. Local materials replace imported ones. Iron is rare and difficult. Slow becomes more attractive, not because it is better, but because it is available. Communities reorganize around what they can control. Violence decreases not because peace is achieved, but because raiding yields diminishing returns. There are no rich storehouses left, no tribute convoys, no surplus to steal. Collapse slows when complexity is gone. What remains is not recovery yet, but a long, quiet pause. A world catching its breath at a much lower level of ambition. When history resumes, it does not pick up where it left off. The most obvious legacy is political. The great palace states never return. In their place emerge smaller, more flexible polity states, tribal confederations, regional kingdoms. Power decentralizes. Authority becomes personal, negotiated, and often violent. Economically, the collapse breaks elite monopolies. With long-distance trade gone, luxury economies shrink. Status is no longer defined by imported goods, but by land, followers, and control of local resources. Inequality does not vanish, but it changes shape. Culturally, memory fractures. Writing systems disappear in much of Greece and Anatolia for centuries. Oral tradition takes over. Stories replace archives. This is not ignorance, it is adaptation. Knowledge becomes portable, not bureaucratic. Technologically, the shift to iron quietly transforms warfare and agriculture. Iron tools spread slowly, unevenly, but they are cheaper and locally sourced. Access to weapons broadens. So does the potential for instability, and perhaps most important is the psychological legacy. The assumption that complexity equals security is gone. Societies that emerge afterward are more suspicious of scale, more aware that systems can fail catastrophically. Out of the ruins of the Bronze Age come new myths, new identities, and eventually new civilizations built on the memory of collapse. The Late Bronze Age collapse is not a story about the past failing. It is a story about success pushed too far. A world rich in trade, diplomacy, technology, and confidence discovered with warning that efficiency can erase resilience. And connection can transmit disaster as easily as wealth. No single villain caused the collapse. No single fix could stop it. The danger came from alignment, climate stress, political rigidity, migration, and network failure striking at the same time. Our world is different, but the pattern is familiar. We, too, depend on systems we rarely see. Supply chains that cross oceans, energy networks that assume stability, institutions that work until they don't. Like the Bronze Age, we tend to notice collapse only when it reaches our doorstep. The ruins of Ugarit remind us that people can do everything right and still lose the world they know. That collapse does not announce itself as an ending, but as a series of manageable problems until suddenly they are not manageable at all. History does not repeat, but it rhymes under pressure. And the question the Bronze Age leaves us with is not how they failed, but whether we are listening closely enough to recognize the sound of systems beginning to crack. Anyways, I'm future watching the past so we can understand the present, and together we keep history reborn. I'll see you in the next era.